Professor Keth Moran adjusted his ceremonial teaching robes and gazed smugly across the lecture hall of the Galactic Academy's most prestigious facility. The Vorthak's 4 eyes gleamed with self-satisfaction as he surveyed his latest batch of students, all supposedly the toughest specimens their respective species had to offer. "Welcome, hardy souls, to Deathworld Survival 101, he announced, his voice dripping with theatrical pomposity. "I am Professor Keth Moran, and I have personally catalogued over 300 worlds that would reduce most of you to cosmic dust within minutes." The holographic displays flickered to life around the circular amphitheater, showing rotating images of the galaxy's most nightmarish planets. Acid storms raged across crimson landscapes, gravity wells that could crush diamonds into powder, and radiation levels that would cook most organic matter in seconds. The students, a mix of what the galaxy considered its most resilient species, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. There was Zara Finn, an Altarian whose people survived in sub-zero temperatures that would freeze helium solid. Grim Boltsack represented the Krex Empire, his species known for their armored hide that could deflect plasma rounds. A few Thorian mountain dwellers rounded out the group, their massive frames built to withstand atmospheric pressures that would implode most starships. Each of these worlds, Professor Keth Moran continued, gesturing dramatically at the swirling holograms, represents a death sentence for 99.9% of known galactic species. The environmental hazards alone would liquefy your organs before you could even scream for help. That's when several students noticed him. Sitting quietly in the back row, almost overlooked among the towering alien forms, was a single human. Marcus Webb looked remarkably unremarkable, his pale pink skin and soft features making him appear almost fragile compared to his classmates. "Is that a human?" whispered Zara, her crystalline voice tinkling with disbelief. Grim's mandibles clicked in what passed for laughter among his people. Poor little mammal probably got lost looking for basic xenobiology. Someone should tell him this class is for actual survivors, not walking protein snacks. The snickering spread through the classroom like a wave. Here they were, the toughest beings from across the galaxy, and somehow a member of one of the most notoriously fragile species had wandered into their advanced course. Marcus simply sat there, quietly taking notes, apparently oblivious to the attention he was drawing. Professor Keth Moran cleared his throat with a sound like grinding metal, clearly relishing his moment to terrify his students. "Now then, let us begin with the classification system that has kept civilized species alive for millennia. Deathworlds fall into several categories, each more horrifying than the last." The first hologram materialized above their heads, showing a planet shrouded in sickly green clouds. Category 7, Acid Rain Worlds. The precipitation on these nightmares contains sulfuric compounds so concentrated they can dissolve starship hulls in minutes. The very air burns through respiratory systems like liquid fire. Most species experience complete organ failure within 30 seconds of exposure. Several students involuntarily covered their breathing apparatus. Zara's normally pale blue skin had gone completely white, while Grim's armored plates actually rattled with nervous energy. Category 8, High-Gravity Crushers, the professor continued, his voice rising with theatrical flair. The hologram shifted to show a dark, dense world where even the mountains seemed to be collapsing under their own weight. Gravity wells so intense that your bones would snap like twigs, your circulatory system would fail instantly, and your organs would be compressed into paste before you could even comprehend the agony. A few students actually whimpered. One of the Thorians, despite his species' legendary durability, had gone green around his facial ridges. The professor was just getting started. Category 9, Radiation Hellscapes. Cosmic radiation so intense it strips electrons from atoms, turning living tissue into radioactive soup. Your DNA would unravel like cheap fabric, your cells would literally cook from the inside out. And your final moments would be spent watching your own body dissolve into component molecules. By now, half the class was looking distinctly ill. The other half was frantically taking notes about protective equipment and emergency protocols. And finally, Professor Keth Moran's voice dropped to an ominous whisper, Category 10, Predator-Infested Jungles. Worlds where evolution has gone completely mad, creating ecosystems where literally everything, from the smallest insects to the largest predators, exists solely to hunt and consume other life forms. The plants themselves are carnivorous. The very ground beneath your feet might be a living entity waiting to devour you. And the apex predators are so perfectly adapted for killing that they make our worst nightmares seem like children's bedtime stories. The classroom had gone completely silent except for the sound of several students trying not to vomit. That's when Professor Keth Moran noticed something odd. While his other students were exhibiting appropriate levels of terror and fascination, the human in the back row was simply taking notes with the casual interest of someone attending a mildly interesting weather report. Marcus Webb had even yawned twice during the radiation hellscape description. The professor's 4 eyes narrowed with irritation. Here he was, delivering his most dramatic lecture about the galaxy's most terrifying environments, and this pink mammal looked like he was about to fall asleep. Perhaps Professor Keth Moran said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "Our human friend would like to share his thoughts on surviving a Category 9 acid storm?" Marcus Webb slowly stood up from his seat and stretching his arms above his head with the kind of leisurely movement that suggested he'd been sitting through a particularly boring lecture about tax regulations rather than a terrifying discourse on galactic death traps. Every eye in the classroom was now fixed on him, waiting to see how this fragile-looking mammal would respond to being put on the spot. "Acid rain?" Marcus said, his voice carrying a tone of mild confusion, as if the professor had just asked him about something as mundane as weekend plans. "Oh, you mean like the time it rained sulfuric acid for 3 weeks straight in Detroit back in 2387? Yeah, we just used umbrellas with better polymer coatings. The city actually made a decent profit selling acid-resistant gear to tourists who wanted to experience it." The classroom erupted in nervous laughter. Clearly, the human was making some kind of joke. Acid rain that lasted for weeks? Tourists paying to experience it? The very idea was absurd beyond comprehension. Professor Keth Moran's mandibles clicked with irritation. "I hardly think this is the time for humor, Mr. Webb. We are discussing genuine environmental hazards that could—" "Hold on," Marcus interrupted, reaching into his satchel and pulling out a standard personal datapad. "Let me show you some footage from home. You guys might find this interesting." The holographic display above their heads flickered as Marcus wirelessly connected his device. Suddenly, the terrifying images of alien Deathworlds were replaced by what appeared to be recordings from Earth. The first video showed a massive rotating column of wind and debris tearing across a landscape, obliterating everything in its path. "This is called a tornado," Marcus explained conversationally. "They happen pretty regularly in certain parts of North America. Wind speeds can reach over 300 kilometers per hour. Several students gasped. That was faster than most atmospheric vehicles. The display shifted to show a hurricane viewed from orbit, a massive spiral of destruction covering half a continent. Hurricane Patricia, 2385, a Category 5 storm. Sustained winds of 250 kilometers per hour, storm surge that could drown coastal cities. Zara's crystalline voice cracked with disbelief. "How do your people survive such things?" "Oh, we mostly just evacuate and come back afterward to rebuild," Marcus shrugged. "Some folks actually chase these things for entertainment. Storm chasers, we call them. They drive right into the middle of the storms to get better footage." The professor's 4 eyes were now fixed on the display with growing horror as it showed volcanic eruptions spewing lava hundreds of meters into the air, little blizzards that buried entire cities under meters of frozen precipitation, and lightning storms that turned the sky into a blazing web of electrical death. "These are normal weather patterns on your homeworld?" Professor Keth Moran's voice had lost most of its earlier pompousness. "Sure," Marcus nodded, switching to a new video. "This is Mount Vesuvius during its 2389 eruption. Pretty mild compared to some of the others we've had. Oh, and this here is footage from a skiing competition during a whiteout blizzard in the Alps. Visibility was about 2 meters. Wind chill factor brought the temperature down to -60 degrees Celsius. Your people do recreational activities in conditions that would kill most galactic species? Grimm's armored plates had stopped rattling and were now pressed flat against his body in a defensive posture. Marcus grinned. We literally throw ourselves out of flying vehicles for fun. It's called skydiving, or base jumping if you want to do it from stationary objects like mountains or buildings. Some people do it without parachutes if the landing zone has enough powder snow. The classroom had gone completely silent again, but this time it wasn't from fear of the professor's descriptions. It was from the growing realization that they might be sharing their advanced survival course with a member of a species that considered galactic-level Deathworld conditions to be recreational opportunities. Professor Keth Moran's academic pride was now thoroughly wounded. Here he was, one of the galaxy's foremost experts on Deathworld survival, being casually upstaged by what he had assumed was the most fragile student in his class. His 4 eyes blazed with indignation as he watched his other students murmuring among themselves, their earlier confidence in his expertise clearly shaken. Enough. The professor snapped, his voice echoing through the lecture hall. Videos and anecdotes are one thing, Mr. Webb, but let's see how your species handles a real Deathworld scenario. Not some convenient historical footage, but an actual survival situation. Marcus raised an eyebrow with mild interest. Sure, sounds fun. What did you have in mind? The professor's mandibles spread in what he probably thought was a menacing grin. The Academy's advanced simulation chamber. We'll see how well your casual attitude serves you when you're actually facing death instead of just talking about it. Within minutes, the entire class had relocated to the Academy's most sophisticated training facility. The simulation chamber was a massive sphere lined with holographic projectors and environmental controls capable of recreating any known planetary conditions with deadly accuracy. It was typically reserved for final examinations and military training exercises. I'm setting this to the most challenging scenario in our database, Professor Keth Moran announced, his fingers dancing across the control panel with vindictive glee. Planet more death. Triple gravity. Atmosphere composed of chlorine gas mixed with sulfuric acid vapor, carnivorous vegetation, and predatory fauna that makes our worst nightmares look like domesticated pets. The other students had gathered around the observation windows, their earlier amusement now replaced with genuine concern. Even they wouldn't survive 5 minutes in conditions like that. How long do you think he'll last? Zara whispered to Grimm. I'm betting 30 seconds before he hits the emergency beacon, Grimm replied, his armored plates clicking nervously. Maybe 45 if he's stubborn. I'll take that bet, said one of the Thorians, 20 seconds. That gravity alone will crush his fragile bone structure. Marcus, meanwhile, was calmly checking the standard Academy survival gear he'd been provided, a basic atmospheric suit, emergency rations, a multi-purpose tool, and a distress beacon. Standard equipment that was designed to keep most species alive for perhaps an hour under moderate threat conditions. Ready when you are, Professor Marcus called out, adjusting the straps on his pack with the same casual attention someone might give to preparing for a morning jog. Professor Keth Moran's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he activated the simulation, initiating Planet More Death scenario in 3, 2, 1. The chamber transformed instantly. The air became a toxic, roiling mass of greenish vapor that would have sent most species into immediate respiratory failure. The gravity field engaged with a crushing force that made the observation deck's reinforced floor creak ominously. Twisted, thorn-covered vegetation sprouted from the simulated ground, their leaves already turning toward Marcus with predatory intent. The students pressed against the observation windows, waiting for the inevitable collapse. Instead, Marcus took a deep breath through his suit's filtration system and immediately dropped into a low, stable stance that distributed his weight evenly against the crushing gravity. His breathing became slow and controlled, a technique that looked suspiciously practiced. Is he doing some kind of meditation? Zara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. High-altitude breathing exercises, Marcus called out, apparently having heard her through the chamber's audio system. Learned this climbing Everest when I was 16. You adjust your respiratory rate to maximize oxygen absorption in low-pressure environments. works pretty well for toxic atmospheres, too, as long as your filtration system can handle the chemical composition. He began moving through the hostile environment with fluid, economical motions, testing his footing carefully but without any apparent panic. When one of the carnivorous plants lashed out at him with a tendril covered in needle-sharp thorns, he simply sidestepped and continued walking as if he'd encountered nothing more threatening than a particularly aggressive houseplant. "This is actually pretty nice," Marcus commented conversationally, pausing to examine some of the local flora. "Reminds me of that hiking trip I took through the Amazon after the bioweapon incident of 2391. Similar vegetation patterns, though these plants seem a bit less aggressive than the ones we had back home." The betting pool among the students had gone completely silent. 20 minutes into the simulation, just as the students were beginning to accept that Marcus might actually survive longer than expected, the chamber's environmental controls announced the arrival of Planet More Death's apex predator with a bone-chilling roar that made the observation deck's reinforced walls vibrate. The creature that materialized from the toxic mists was the stuff of galactic nightmares. Standing 4 meters tall at the shoulder, it resembled a cross between an armored tank and a living siege engine. Its hide was covered in overlapping plates that could deflect military-grade plasma rounds, while acid-dripping mandibles the size of starship hull cutters clicked ominously as it tested the air for prey. 6 legs ending in razor-sharp claws could tear through reinforced steel, and the bioluminescent patches along its spine indicated it was fully mature and extremely aggressive. "Oh, now that's interesting," Marcus said, stopping in his tracks but showing no signs of panic. "Hexapetal predator, probably evolved from a burrowing species based on those claws. Acid production suggests it's used to breaking down heavily armored prey." The beast's sensory organs locked onto Marcus immediately, and it began stalking toward him with the patient, a terrifying gait of a creature that had never encountered anything it couldn't eventually kill and consume. "Run, you fool!" Grimm shouted from the observation deck, his armored plates rattling with anxiety. "Instead, Marcus crouched down behind a cluster of rocks and began observing the creature's movement patterns with the focused attention of a naturalist studying a particularly interesting species of bird. He watched how it tested the ground before each step, noted the way its head swiveled to track sounds, and paid careful attention to how it reacted to different environmental stimuli. "Territorial display behavior," he murmured to himself, apparently unaware that his commentary was being broadcast to the increasingly frantic observers. "Probably claims hunting grounds through scent marking. Uses those acid glands for both digestion and defense. Interesting adaptation." The predator was now less than 10 meters away and preparing to charge when Marcus suddenly stood up and began moving laterally across the simulated landscape. But instead of running in terror, he was positioning himself near a particular rock formation that looked suspiciously unstable. Professor Kethmaran watched in growing disbelief as the human began throwing small stones, not at the predator, but at specific points along the cliff face above it. Each throw was precisely calculated, targeting stress points in the rock formation with the accuracy of someone who clearly understood basic geology and physics. "He's not trying to hurt it," Zara whispered in amazement. "He's engineering a trap." The landslide that followed was both spectacular and precisely controlled. Tons of simulated rock came crashing down, not on the predator itself, but in a carefully calculated pattern that blocked its primary escape routes while leaving it trapped but unharmed in a natural cage of fallen stone. The beast roared in frustration, spitting acid at the rocks, but Marcus had already moved on to his next priority, food and shelter. "Okay, let's see what's edible around here," he said, approaching some of the carnivorous plants with the same casual interest he'd shown the apex predator. The students watched in horror as Marcus began testing small pieces of the obviously toxic vegetation, chewing tiny amounts and spitting them out while paying careful attention to his body's reactions. "He's going to poison himself," one of the Thorians gasped. "No, he's not," Marcus called back, apparently having overheard. "You build up resistance to toxins gradually. Plus, most poisonous plants have a bitter taste as a warning mechanism. These actually taste kind of sweet," which usually means they're trying to attract something. Probably digestive enzymes rather than actual toxins. Within an hour, Marcus had identified 3 different types of edible flora and had begun constructing a shelter using fallen branches, simulated debris, and what appeared to be an advanced understanding of structural engineering. The shelter wasn't just functional, it was actually comfortable, with a rainwater collection system and a ventilation design that filtered the toxic atmosphere. Professor Keth Moran, his academic pride now in complete freefall, began frantically adjusting the simulation parameters. He increased the gravity to 4 times normal, introduced acid rain, and spawned additional predators. Marcus barely seemed to notice. He'd begun humming what sounded like an old Earth folk song while crafting tools from salvaged materials, apparently treating the escalating Deathworld scenario as nothing more challenging than a weekend camping trip. "The acid rain is actually helpful," he mentioned conversationally, setting up a collection system to gather the corrosive precipitation. "Makes it easier to separate the useful minerals from the rock formations. And the extra gravity is great for core strength training." The observation deck had gone completely silent. The betting pool had been forgotten. Even Professor Keth Moran had stopped adjusting the simulation parameters and was simply staring at the human who had somehow turned their most deadly training scenario into what appeared to be a relaxing outdoor vacation. "What kind of death world did this species evolve on?" Zara whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and terror. 3 hours later, Professor Keth Moran reluctantly ended the simulation, not because Marcus had failed or even shown signs of distress, but because the human had somehow managed to completely transform their most deadly training scenario into what could only be described as a thriving eco-resort. The chamber's environmental controls powered down to reveal Marcus's handiwork. Where there had once been a hostile, barren wasteland designed to kill anything that entered it, there was now a well-organized camp complete with multiple shelters, a functioning water purification system, and what appeared to be the beginnings of sustainable agriculture. Even more impossibly, several of the chamber's deadly predators were now docilely following Marcus around like oversized pets. "How did you domesticate a more death apex predator?" Professor Keth Moran asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus scratched behind what might have been the creature's ears, earning a contented rumbling sound that no one had ever heard from one of these simulated killing machines before. "Oh, this big fellow? Just needed some positive reinforcement training." Turns out he was just territorially aggressive because he was hungry and stressed. A few treats and some consistent behavioral cues, and he's actually quite friendly. Reminds me of my neighbor's Rottweiler back home. The class sat in stunned silence as Marcus emerged from the chamber, brushing simulated dirt from his hands as if he'd just finished a pleasant afternoon of gardening rather than surviving in what was supposed to be the galaxy's most hostile environment. "Right," Marcus said, settling back into his seat with the same casual attitude he'd maintained throughout the entire ordeal. "So what were we talking about before? Deathworld survival techniques?" "How?" Zara's crystalline voice cracked with disbelief. "How is any of this possible? What kind of training do your people receive to prepare for situations like this?" Marcus shrugged. "I grew up in Australia, mate. You know, the continent where literally everything tries to kill you. This was actually pretty tame compared to a typical weekend camping trip in the outback." Professor Keth Moran's mandibles began clicking rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation among his species. "Australia? Is that some kind of military training facility?" "Nah, just one of our continents," Marcus replied cheerfully. "Beautiful place, really? Great beaches, fantastic wildlife? Though you do have to watch out for the box jellyfish, blue-ringed octopus, funnel web spiders, saltwater crocodiles, inland taipans, and the drop bears, of course." He maintained a completely straight face while listing these creatures, his tone suggesting he was discussing mildly inconvenient weather patterns rather than potentially lethal fauna. "Drop bears?" Grim asked, his armored plates now pressed so flat against his body he looked like he was trying to disappear entirely. "Vicious little things," Marcus nodded solemnly. "Look like harmless marsupials until they drop out of trees onto unsuspecting tourists. Razor-sharp claws, aggressive territorial behavior. We lose a few dozen people to them every year. Professor Keth Moran was frantically accessing the galactic database, his 4 eyes scanning data streams with increasing panic. Wait, your homeworld, Earth, it's not listed in any of our Deathworld classifications. According to our records, it's classified as a standard class M garden world suitable for most carbon-based life forms. Yeah, that's because your surveyor teams probably only spent a few hours in the safe zones, Marcus laughed. Earth's got a bit of a reputation for being deceptively dangerous. We've got weather systems that can level cities, geological activity that regularly reshapes entire continents, and wildlife that ranges from mildly venomous to extinction-level predator. The professor's voice was now little more than a horrified whisper. Wait, you mean your species evolved on a planet with creatures that can kill you in under a minute? Under a minute? Marcus raised an eyebrow. Professor, some of our wildlife can kill you in under 10 seconds. And that's just from the stuff that lives in shallow tide pools. Professor Keth Moran slumped in his chair, his 4 eyes staring blankly at the holographic displays that now seemed laughably inadequate compared to the casual horrors Marcus had just described. His academic authority, built over decades of studying what he thought were the galaxy's most dangerous environments, had been completely demolished by a single human who treated galactic deathworlds like weekend recreation areas. Perhaps, the professor said weakly, his voice barely audible, Mr. Webb would be willing to share some of his expertise with the class? Marcus looked genuinely surprised. Really? I mean, I'm not qualified to teach or anything. I just picked up some basic survival stuff from Boy Scouts. A bit of military training, and you know, typical Tuesday afternoons in Florida. Tuesday afternoons in Florida, Zara repeated, her crystalline voice cracking with what might have been hysteria. Hurricane season, Marcus explained matter-of-factly. Ooh, good practice for pattern recognition and rapid environmental adaptation. Plus Florida has this great mix of deadly wildlife, extreme weather, and unpredictable geological events. Really keeps you on your toes. The students exchanged glances that clearly said they were no longer sure whether Marcus was joking or if Earth was genuinely the most terrifying place in the known galaxy. Right then, Marcus continued, standing up and moving to the front of the classroom with the easy confidence of someone who had apparently stumbled into teaching by accident. I suppose the first thing you need to understand about real survival is that most species think about it completely backward. He gestured to the holographic displays showing the various Deathworld categories. You're all focused on avoiding dangers, which makes sense from a logical standpoint. But human survival philosophy is based on adaptive utilization rather than avoidance. Adaptive what now? Grim asked, his armored plates finally starting to relax slightly. We turn disadvantages into advantages, Marcus grinned. When life gives you killer hurricanes, you surf them. When it gives you venomous snakes, you make boots. When you've got predators that can kill you in 10 seconds, you study their hunting patterns and learn to hunt them back. He pulled out a length of standard academy rope from his pack. For example, most survival courses probably teach you about equipment maintenance and emergency protocols, right? But how many of you know basic knot tying? The blank stares from around the classroom answered that question clearly. This is a bowline knot, Marcus said, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. Creates a fixed loop that won't slip under tension, can be tied one-handed, and is easy to untie even after being loaded with significant weight. Sailors have been using it for thousands of years. The students began frantically taking notes as if Marcus had just revealed some profound cosmic secret rather than demonstrated a basic rope technique that most human children learned before adolescence. The key to human survival methodology, Marcus continued, moving on to demonstrate a clove hitch, is pattern recognition combined with creative problem-solving. We observe how systems work, identify their weaknesses and strengths, then figure out how to exploit both for our benefit. He tied off the rope and moved to the holographic controls. Mind if I borrow this for a demonstration, Professor? Professor Keth Moran waved weakly in what might have been permission. Marcus called up one of the earlier Deathworld scenarios, the Category 8 high-gravity crusher. Most species look at this and think, how do we protect ourselves from the crushing force? Humans look at it and think, how can we use that crushing force to our advantage? He sketched out a quick diagram in the air using the holographic interface. High gravity means anything you drop falls faster and hits harder. It also means running water has more erosive power, structural collapses are more dramatic. It means simple mechanical advantages like levers and pulleys become exponentially more effective. You would weaponize the environment itself, Zara whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of admiration and terror. We weaponize everything, Marcus nodded cheerfully. Climate, geography, local fauna, available materials, even social dynamics if we're dealing with intelligent threats. The universe is basically one giant toolbox if you know how to look at it properly. Professor Keth Moran made a sound that might have been a whimper as his understanding of survival training was fundamentally reorganized by what appeared to be casual human common sense within 48 hours of what would later be known throughout the Galactic Academy as the incident. The word had spread to every department, faculty lounge, and student dormitory about the human who had casually conquered their most advanced survival simulation while treating it like a recreational camping trip. Marcus Webb had become something of a legend, though he seemed completely oblivious to his newfound celebrity status. Mr. Webb, Dean Veltara cornered him after his second day of classes, her tentacles writhing with barely contained excitement. We've had 17 different professors request consultations with you about updating their curriculum. The Department of Xenobiology wants to interview you about Earth's ecosystem. The Military Strategy Division is asking if you'd be willing to guest lecture on environmental exploitation, tactics. And the Psychological Warfare Department, she paused, looking slightly disturbed. Well, they want to study how your species maintains such casual attitudes toward mortal peril. Marcus scratched his head with the same casual gesture he'd used when domesticating the apex predator. It seems like a bit much. I mean, I'm just here to get my degree in interstellar communications. I'm not really qualified to teach anything. You single-handedly revolutionized our understanding of survival methodology, Dean Veltara insisted. Professor Keth Moran has submitted a formal request to have Earth reclassified from Garden World to Mythical Deathworld Category 11. That's a classification we've never used before because we didn't think any planet could be that dangerous and still support intelligent life. Marcus laughed, a sound that had become both beloved and terrifying to the Academy staff. Nah, Earth's pretty mild once you get used to it. You should see what we do for vacation. Ever heard of volcano boarding? Or swimming with great white sharks? Oh. And there's this thing called free solo rock climbing where you scale 1,000-meter cliff faces without any safety equipment just for the adrenaline rush. Dean Veltara's tentacles went completely limp. For fun? The best kind of fun, Marcus grinned. Nothing beats the rush of voluntarily putting yourself in mortal danger and then using skill and ingenuity to survive. It's practically the human national pastime. 3 months later, the Galactic Academy's first ever field trip to Earth was about to begin. The original Deathworld survival class, along with several faculty members and a handful of brave graduate students, had somehow convinced themselves that experiencing a mild Earth environment would be educational. They were currently huddled inside the reinforced observation shelter that Marcus had helped them construct on a hillside in what he assured them was one of the safest places on the continent, apparently somewhere called Montana during what humans referred to as mild weather season. It's just a little thunderstorm, Marcus called out cheerfully from outside the shelter, where he was setting up what appeared to be some kind of food preparation equipment. Perfect weather for a barbecue, really. The lightning makes for great ambient lighting. Through the shelter's reinforced windows, the alien students watched in horror as electrical discharges that could power a small city danced across the sky while Marcus calmly arranged processed meat products on a metal grill. Each thunderclap made them flinch, while the human seemed to be using the noise as a timing mechanism for flipping his food. The atmospheric electrical activity has intensified by 300% in the last 10 minutes, Zara whispered, her crystalline form pressed against the shelter's back wall. How is he not dead? Statistical probability suggests he should have been electrocuted at least 7 times by now, Grimm added, his armored plates rattling with each thunder crash. Professor Keth Moran, who had insisted on joining the expedition despite his colleagues' concerns for his mental health, was taking extensive notes while muttering to himself. Remarkable adaptation to electrical hazards, apparent immunity to acoustic shock trauma, possible electromagnetic field manipulation abilities. Marcus knocked on the shelter door, holding a plate of what smelled like surprisingly appetizing cooked meat. Dinner's ready, everyone. Fresh grilled burgers with all the fixings. And don't worry about the storm, it's supposed to clear up in a few hours. Tomorrow I thought we'd try something really fun, whitewater rafting on the Yellowstone River. It's only Class 4 rapids, so basically kiddie pool stuff. Professor Keth Moran finally looked up from his notes, his 4 eyes focusing on Marcus with something that might have been respect, terror, or possibly both. Perhaps, he said slowly, we need to update our curriculum. Marcus grinned, raising his voice slightly to be heard over another thunderclap. Welcome to Earth, folks. Try not to die from a spider bite on your first day.